I'm in my backyard. North Carolina.
Geology, geology, geology. Welcome everybody to the mini geology show where we put in connection our beloved science of geology and earth sciences to society at large. And today we have with us Mark Little. And I brought in here Mark Little because geologists they can become economic developers, and I'm not referring to geologists that are part of a large company which obviously develops the economy. I'm referring to the bright minds of earth scientists that invent and realize new ways to develop a specific facet of the economy. That's the reason why today we have with us Mark Little, who is the executive director of Create, an initiative that builds shared prosperity through applied interventions, research, and policy. So Mark has a PhD in geology and geophysics, and therefore he belongs to the family, the great geological community family. However, now Mark works at the intersection of academics, policy, and private sector businesses. So he chose to move to this area to lead initiatives that generate new knowledge, improve lives, and yes, create economic opportunity. So today, let's try to gain some of this knowledge on how exciting and how difficult it has to be to live and work in this intersection of academics, policy, and business. Welcome to the show. Welcome to Mini Geology, Mark.
Thank you for having me. Excited to have a conversation.
Mark, in your Twitter, you present yourself as Atlantic African, musician composer, earth scientist, economic developer, Black community founder, writer, Baba. What do you feel today?
I'm all those things all the time.
So, Mark,
Yeah.
it is so beautiful to have a multifaceted earth scientist, a multifaceted person, an eclectic person with us in here, that part of it belongs to the geological community. I would like to walk with you through the changes in your brain and try to understand what changed in your mind when you decide to move away from the technicalities of geology and geophysics and move to this intersection of academics, policy, and business.
Yeah. So there's two ways you can do this. One is if I'm in a job interview, I make it sound very planned and I did this because it would build this skill and all that. But the reality of it is there wasn't personally a grand plan. So to answer your specific question, how I made this transition, actually, before I went back to grad school, I was it wasn't something I was destined to do. I should say that to go back to grad school for geology and geophysics. And so when I did, I actually was very interested in using that degree, using that knowledge to have some policy impact. And so actually one of the reasons that I chose to come to Rice University was because of the opportunity to work with policymakers while I was in grad school doing geology and geophysics. So it's always been there. It's always been part of the plan, part of my interest.
I see. Is this the sincere answer, or this is the answer you would give to a potential employer?
I mean, so I mean, it's the sincere answer is that I always have that interest. In terms of my job progressing, like actual, I mean, the reality there is it's all been fortuitous. I'll say for myself, I have had the opportunity to give advice to a lot of students, all along the way, ever since in high school. Mentoring other students, and I'm always impressed with people who have options, right? Because they have, they apply for multiple jobs and they say, "Oh, should I go work for this company?" At every juncture in my life, I usually have not had many options. And now I'll say the option that I've taken has been a wonderful option, but uh, when I started doing this work in economic development, actually I had just started working with a startup company. It was actually energy related startup. And I started working at UNC Chapel Hill, where I am currently, just because I was in Chapel Hill and I needed some part-time work while I was working on this startup with a friend. And I kind of fell into it, right? And I had the interest in policy, the interest in economic development, broadly sustainable development, the interest in actually working in communities where my family and is from. Those are all things that I was aware of, wanted to do in some kind of sense, but it was not any kind of career plan. And so I really fell into that. And so when the startup didn't start up, that work grew and grew into, over time into what it's become today.
Mark, I read that CREATE is an economic development center, which is tackling this increasing income disparities in the middle class. And CREATE, by the way, is CREATE an acronym?
It is not.
Okay, so CREATE tackle this increasing income disparities by generating shared economic prosperity through a combination of research, data analytics, homegrown interventions, and policy development. So, what do you need to move from a technical work on earth science or engineer or just think about a medical doctor? What do you need to move from that technical work to this other work on creating economic prosperity that you do in CREATE?
And maybe let me back up a little bit to something that you hinted at, which is that you made a juxtaposition between the earth sciences and the work that I'm doing now. But I'll say, just like the earth sciences as a discipline is very interdisciplinary itself. The earth sciences requires someone to at least gain some understanding, if not fluency, in many different tools: math, physics, chemistry, even biology, in addition to basic geology tenets and understanding. And so I think that itself was one of the reasons why I was interested in earth sciences, just as myself, because I am interested in lots of different things. And so, to answer your question, one of the most useful things that people can have, I think, when transitioning to any different kind of job, is really try to articulate the skills that they have and that they've learned, and translate those skills into a new environment. And so, if you have worked in a lab, attention to detail, the understanding that small measurement errors will mean that the results of your test are completely useless, right? What does that mean when you're talking about making a presentation to community members? Let's say, for example, in some of the work I do, we might be organizing a community meeting in a rural community in Eastern North Carolina. What does it mean? Where's the translation there? And the translation in my mind is, okay, I need to be very careful, right? And so it's not about an aliquot of something or a gram of something, it's my words. And so I need to be very, very careful with what I say, how I speak, because an error in this presentation can mean that whatever work we try to do can be ruined, right? And so one of the things that I really try to do is understand all the little nuggets of knowledge and information that I may have come in contact with, I may have observed in other people, and then still like, well, what's the usefulness of that in some new situation that may on a surface look completely different, but there's some knowledge, understanding from that can come to bear. I will also say that the bulk of my work now is not earth science, but it does come in actually, in terms of the knowledge itself, it does occasionally come in more broadly, issues around energy and environment absolutely come into the work fairly regularly. And so in that way, there have been actually been some, fairly direct connections, at least understanding the body of work broadly around earth sciences and the environmental sciences that has been really helpful to the work on the ground that we do now.
So if I understand well, Mark, there are still some little overlap on geosciences with your work, but the most important thing is the methodological overlap. So what you're suggesting is that if an engineer or a doctor or a geologist want to move into this other area where you intersect these three worlds of policymaking, academy, and industry, the most important thing is to be ready to know your skills and how to transport them. And you, in a way, you enlist those skills of the geoscientists that are the rigor, the attention to the detail, maybe the multiple scales that they are capable to work on, the multiple methods. You work in the field, in the lab, with workstation, with offshore, in the outcrops. Then you have this integration of different disciplines, as you mentioned. And then maybe also that kind of mindset to start with a local data set and from those local data try to create a global idea. Or is that correct?
It is. And I also think that there are, talk about different disciplines, you mentioned earth sciences and engineering. I think that there are very intrinsic differences to some of these disciplines in terms of the philosophical way that they approach knowledge creation and knowledge use that are very different. And so with earth sciences, one of the things that was very attractive to me about it versus some other disciplines is the opportunity to think very big with very small amounts of information. I really enjoyed that. And I think that that is something that's unusual. So being both able to do very small scale granular work in the lab or on your computer, but then also to scale that and try at least ask questions on the grandest of scales is great. And I'm also very attracted to physics. And so actually in undergrad, before switching to earth sciences, I was a physics major first, astrophysics. And so these kind of big questions based on small amounts of information and math are very interesting to me. And so again, for me personally, in the work that I'm doing now, kind of what that means is a lot of the communities that we're working in have been struggling economically for a very long time. And much of the work that we do, you talked about these three areas, kind of on the ground interventions, policy work, and research. Pretty much all of those they're very based in reality and very dependent on the past to understand kind of what's possible. But I think one of the reasons why I do some of this work well is because I'm not so immersed intellectually in that. And I can sort of step back and say, well, there are other things that are possible, right? And pulling in examples from other sides of the planet, right? Because I mean, we talked earlier and you mentioned you were from Italy. Many people who are from a place and grew up in that place and stay in a place have difficulty seeing perspectives from other geographies, right? And so, for example, like you traveled somewhere else, and so you bring that other perspective with you. And so it's not only that you have these two perspectives, you actually in that transition it's opened your mind to just think, well, maybe the things that I knew before that just don't matter, right? And I think there's a little bit of that kind of thinking that's important to the earth sciences, to making new transitions and understandings about knowledge. And it's a way of thinking that I brought with me into the work that I do in economic development to try to say, like, just because this is what's been happening, it's not, let's look on the other side of the planet, some other place that has all the tools that you have, maybe has a similar history, but now is doing something different, right? They may look different, they speak a different language, but like what, and again, it's not the same. I understand all of that, right? But let's think about what are those connections. Let's just be inspired and try to learn something from that.
Yes, if I can say something personally,
Mm.
I agree and see what you see when you look at the past, because obviously the past and history is a great enrichment for humankind, but it could be a heavy lift that you drag behind you. So coming from Italy, with respect to the New World, I experience that nice heavy weight that we have to drag ourselves on, and the culture that we call it culture, that sometimes it becomes an obstacle for innovation. So I understand that, especially now after living 10 years here in the US, in Texas. Yeah, but let me be the devil's advocate in here. Isn't it better to allow the economists to create economic prosperity?
Well, so that's I don't think economists would actually claim that that's their responsibility. I've gotten to know quite a few of them. Uh, it's an interesting question. So I think really what you're asking is, why do I think I have anything useful to do in this space? Maybe it's kind of one way of framing it. And
And all people like you and all the
yeah,
potential people that will be in your position in the future.
okay. So that one answer is problems that we're trying to solve, the challenges we're trying to overcome have not yet been. And another one is the way that we work and the places that we work in are not really the focus for, let's say, for economists, since you mentioned them in particular. Economists are generally are interested in country scale, maybe state scale issues and those averages. And of course, to your point about increasing disparities, those are observable completely on those scales. Um, However, the places that we're working in particular are not the prioritized way or method to approach and answer these questions. Also, many of the people that I work alongside aren't economists. Also, so you mentioned this intersection between sort of policy and business. Many of the business leaders that we work with are not economists, right? They're actors in these systems that we have. So I think on the piece of not being an economist, that for the type of work that we do, it's not really required. I think that what draws me to this work, and I think what's allowed me to contribute, is actually being pretty open-minded and coming in with an interest in learning and an interest in identifying new, different ways to have an impact. And while someone who has a more traditional background, I'm not saying they couldn't do those things. I think that I may have been actually better suited because I was so ignorant at the beginning of my work, really about the process. And I think doing a PhD in particular is really about that. I remember my advisor at some point saying, once you go through this process, what it means is, yes, you have some particular knowledge about this topic that you did your dissertation on, but what it really means is you know how to learn. And any topic that's out there, if you're interested, you now have the skills to ask questions, find answers to those questions, which of course then lead to more questions, and et cetera. So yeah, so it's not a question I personally think that much about. I know for a lot of people, it is a big question, and it can be daunting, and it can cause a lot of self-doubt about whether you're capable, et cetera. But as I was mentioning, I talked to a lot of students, also just talked to a lot of friends about career and things like that. And what I always say is, like, don't deny yourself the opportunity to do something, right? Before you've even presented it to somebody. In kind of in the context of, let's say, like a job application, what that means is, don't stop yourself from applying for something because you think you won't get it, right? Apply for it, work to get it, and then hopefully get an offer, and then you can decide, right? I mean, and I mean, obviously there's a lot of work that comes with that. You have to make sure you're prepared, et cetera, et cetera. But a big, huge part of it is the mindset. Um, and I think for a lot of us, uh, it's that mindset that is the hardest thing to change.
Let's dive now that you mention it into your mindset. How, who or what influenced the way in which you view life and its meaning? Why are you doing this?
Well, that's a big question. Um, the way that I'll answer it is kind of how I've grown along the way. I'm not somebody who has like there was this one person at a particular time that made me something. It's really just listening and being open minded all along the way. And so obviously my parents and then not in a direct way, but just how they raised me. Um, and I think also observing people and uh, oftentimes sort of seeing the potential in people and in places that maybe they themselves don't realize. Um, and that kind of connects to some of the work that I do now, which really one way that I sort of think about it is helping people and places realize their fullest potential, at least some a little further along than they may be. In terms of the earth science side of things, um, it's funny, how I got into it in the undergrad was I had I think I'll say a very ignorant assumption that if I'm going to go to college, then I should major in science because if you're not going to major in science, then why go to college? So that was my first kind of filter, and um, after that, it really was just looking through the course guide and identifying which classes looked interesting, and they were in the earth sciences. Um, and but later on, really thinking about the long-term trajectory, my PhD advisor had a significant impact on my decision actually to go to graduate school, but how to think broadly about the earth sciences and to see the connections between different interests that you might have that may not be readily apparent. And so I was fortunate to have an advisor who was a great scientist, but also was really great at other things too, and structured his life around those things in a way that they benefited and supported each other. And one, I'll just kind of fast forward to one example of this that I use sometimes when I'm discussing my economic development work in different contexts. So I mentioned that we work on the ground in communities that are economically distressed. And that's a lot of our work, to work, like I said, directly, right? Providing direct technical assistance. And we work with a very broad range of people from all sorts of backgrounds. But we do have a significant amount of work that is with Black folks and historically Black communities. And one of the ways that I talk about the deep history of that is actually to use earth sciences a little bit. And so there's a region, in the southeast that folks call the Black Belt, which is you take a map of the United States by county, so county level, and you look at which of the counties that have the highest percentage of African American population. What you'll see that gets bright on that map is a kind of U-shaped region that starts in southeastern Virginia, goes through eastern North Carolina, down through South Carolina, across Alabama, Mississippi, through Georgia, across Alabama, Mississippi, it's the Mississippi River, it goes up the Mississippi River into western Tennessee, eastern Arkansas. This is also a region that has really good soils for agriculture. And this is the region that had the highest number of enslaved Africans that were brought to the United States. And so there's this connection between land and people and history but also economic development, right? Because these are places that were founded on, their economies were founded on free labor. And now they're still struggling economically because of that history and because of racism. And it's connected, the reason they're in those places is connected to the earth, right? And so, anyway, so just to give you an example of sort of how these connections sort of come together, and I'll just say again, where some of that comes from is, like I said, my PhD advisor, about where these connections between different things that on the surface may seem disconnected, but actually are fundamentally linked together.
Mark, you make me think that I want to come and work with you.
Come on.
Because really, I have goosebumps listening to you and the simple explanation of what you do, and just connecting history, people, and the planet. Really, I really think that many of us, we could add a lot of value into these connections. And talking about history, do you mind if I ask you about your parents? You mentioned them. What kind of people are your parents? What did they teach you?
Well, so what kind of people are they? Well, I like them a lot. So I think they're great people. Maybe I'll answer this two ways. So one is kind of the historical perspective, right? So my parents are both from the same small town in Eastern North Carolina. Their parents are from Eastern North Carolina and South Carolina. And so my parents and our families have deep roots in the sort of the Carolinas. Some of our ancestors were enslaved Africans, most of them. Some of our ancestors were Native American, and some of our ancestors were from Europe. I identify as African American or Black or Atlantic African, as you mentioned from my Twitter account. But I have members of my family who also identify as Indigenous or Native American as well. So deep roots in a particular place, tied to these histories that we were talking about. So that's that's one. That's my parents. In that perspective, as individual people, they are very different from each other in terms of their personalities. You mentioned what did I learn from them? Something that I noticed that is maybe different, at least in my family, from some that people talk about, is a lot of times people talk about, well, there's a particular lesson, like a verbally spoken lesson that their parents told them. And there's some of that with my parents, but that really wasn't a big way in how they raised me. It was more of creating a space and an environment and living in a particular way that I wanted to emulate or I learned from. And so whether it was things like, composting, right? I mean, composting is sort of a thing now because it's, it has a veneer of hipness and coolness, perhaps, in addition to actually having some potentially benefit for our planet. But that's something that my parents, particularly my father, always did when I was little. We had a garden that just was because you just what you're supposed to do. Like, why would you put these things in the trash when you can create soil to grow fruit with? And so it wasn't a verbal lesson. It wasn't like, Mark, I want to tell you something. You should always try to recycle. And it's just we just did it, right? And so those types of lessons were very important to me in terms of what I do, how I interact with people, and those are definitely things that were created by my parents in the house that I grew up in.
So maybe I have 3 kids. Sometimes I think about how to teach them, and maybe you're right. Like being a role model instead of teaching verbally is way more powerful. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it does depend on the person. I mean, I have 3 kids also, and they're all very different from each other. So I hopefully one of them pays attention to something I say verbally, but sometimes it doesn't seem like any of them do.
Or just try to have more kids. So statistically, we're talking about a create.
Mhm.
So as we said, create tackles these income disparities in the middle class by generating shared economic prosperity. And I see that in create, this you have an online platform that tells the stories of small towns that have successfully stimulated these private investments and job creations. And that is useful because these stories inspire other small towns across the nation to leverage their assets.
Mhm.
So I would like to know more about you, this art of the storytelling. Does it work?
It it does, and it can. Um, they're all tools, right? And so, for a lot of places we work, anything that's even currently today, anything that's online really doesn't necessarily connect with people who might be in leadership in a particular community we might be working in. Those case studies of these places, they're tools that can be. They don't just sit on that website, right? So there's some communities that can access that information, that might be in a place that they're ready to use that and be able to make those connections. Kind of going back to what we were saying earlier about this, advice I might have to someone who wants to make a career transition, right? About being able to identify those skills and knowledge that they have in what initially see and then translate them to a new environment. Same is true with these case studies. For some people, they can see something that's in a case study from, let's say, Nebraska. So neither of us are in Nebraska, right? They can see like, okay, I can see the connections. I can see what's useful about this case study that I might want to use in Houston, right? Or I might want to use in a community in North Carolina. But for some of us, they don't see that connection. Like, oh, that's Nebraska. What does that have to do with me? And that's the end. It doesn't really matter, right? It just doesn't connect. And so then we talk about storytelling. It's like story translating, right? And so in the work that we might do when we're talking to someone, we might not say, there's this community in Nebraska, and here's this case study, go look at it online. We might talk with them and help them see those assets that are in their community that maybe connect to what was in this town in Nebraska. And so really it becomes a tool for us, right? For my team or for your team if you're doing similar kind of work. So I guess what I mean is these tools can be used in many different types of ways. The stories, in order to connect with somebody, you have to be willing to be flexible on how you tell the story, how you connect it to them. Because, I mean, as you know, you talk about the sciences, every discipline has, and even subdiscipline has a different vocabulary. And unfortunately, sometimes it's actually even worse if they use similar words because the words don't mean the same thing, right? It'd almost be better if you just use completely different vocabularies, right? So there's got to be this translation work, in order to connect. And one of the things that I did very early on, and I think this is maybe one of the benefits of coming to this work from outside of economic development, is I didn't know any of the words. So I had to learn all the words. And I, I didn't really care that so much about the words, right? I wasn't like, you have to use this word over this word, right? Because as you know, in the science, people can have whole arguments about which word to use for something. And so because I didn't have this fidelity to the language and I was willing to be flexible and I was really interested in the outcome and making connections with people, that when I'm sitting down with that person who doesn't want to hear about Nebraska, right? I can talk to them about their community in the words in the language that they use, right? I'm myself being kind of fueled by these case studies that I may be aware of, but I'm speaking in the language that this person understands, and that's what I'm interested in, right? I'm interested in communicating the idea, and inspiring. The actual word I might be using is it's not important, and sometimes it gets in the way, and can mean that we're uh, they don't want to talk, right? They don't want to engage because they associate those words with something that they don't want to have anything to do with.
Mark, do you think that this skill about communication and storytelling is something that is a natural gift you have, or that you learn with experience, or did you have to really learn how to do it?
It is something that can be learned. perhaps because I've made some pretty big transitions in terms of my career, I think that's helped, because it's like, if you don't, you can't do it, right? You can't do the work if you're not willing to learn these new vocabularies. Um, Also, you mentioned in the list of various things, I'm a musician, right? So I've always played music and language, right? Both verbally and talking with other musicians about the music, but then the music itself. And so cultivating those skills, right? And the thing is, if we're talking about people that we interact with who might be thinking about these transitions, it's probably likely that maybe they've been a musician in the past. They may not think of themselves that in a way anymore, but they've at least attempted, right, to learn some music, or they've played sports of some kind, or maybe they cook in their home. And so they have been doing other things, right? They have been juggling different aspects of things. And so the work can be kind of elevating those and like, okay, these are important. If you spend time on it, it's important, right? And so you might as well gain some other learnings from it. And so if you can, it's like, well, I can function effectively doing my earth science, as well as hopefully a little bit raising my children, and interacting with, let's say if I'm in a community choir or whatever, I can interact with other people in these different spaces. I'm not always talking about, the stable isotopes, or I don't know, whatever the thing is. Like, I know how to use different words, right? And so staying like, okay, well, I'm doing this already in these other spaces. I can do it in this other thing, right? And just being willing, flexible, and just like, okay, I've done it before, I can do it again. And just allowing yourself to learn and let it kind of wash over you in some way. Part of the drive towards that is, try to be generous here. It's a way for more people to find excellence. And so what I mean is, the more narrow the question in the field is, um, the more it's possible for an individual person to be best at that, right? And to know it, right, better than anyone else. And that itself is not a bad thing. But what it does is it makes it very difficult to collaborate. And so one of the things that is quite different, I think, for people who are academic scientists, and maybe academics broadly, is collaborating. That is something that is very central to the work that I do now. It is, I mean, in some ways, it's a skill. Thinking about what the outcome it is that you want. It's like, okay, we want to get to this place, all right? Whether it's better job opportunities, a healthier environment, whatever it is in this place. And there's an infinite number of pathways to get there, right? But I say, well, given what we have control over, what's going to be the simplest pathway there? And oftentimes for us, it means, well, we're going to have to collaborate with a whole bunch of people, right? And if we get credit or not, that's not really, we're interested in that end goal, right? And if there's someone else that's made already halfway there, it's like, well, what can we do to support them to get all the way there, right? And so that kind of thinking, again, is something that I think can be learned, but that's quite different than the sort of typical training. I think generally, like I say, a PhD program where you're really trying to specialize, you're trying to understand something that no one else understands, and get your papers out, be in some ways be a little combative in some ways about your ideas in that space. And again, for certain things those are also useful skills, but to the exclusion of others, they mean that some of these transitions that you might want to make are going to be very difficult. So you mentioned you work in industry, right, which is a very collaborative environment. I mean, you can't be out on your own doing your own thing. And so I think for a lot of people who go into industry, that can also be a difficult transition, if they're very steeped in academia, because they have to learn sort of the benefits of working and how to build those lateral relationships, and really think about the end goal that everyone is trying to get to.
You said you are trying to be very generous, and actually you were very generous, because you said, in other words, do not be too specialist. Do not be too specialist unless you want to become like that maximum expert of that discipline, because otherwise it's going to be difficult to collaborate. I mean, it's more difficult
Yeah.
to collaborate. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and actually, talking about these collaborations, you put together in Create, you put together a network of scholars from across the country to analyze the what I would call the predisposing factors and the triggers of shared economic prosperity. And I was wondering, how could you pull together such a broad and skilled and diverse group of people? I would like to ask you, well, what is this art of bringing together people that you have in Create?
My approach comes out of really how I started this work, which was, I have this earth science background. I'm starting to work in economic development. Um, I don't have any expectation that anyone wants to work with me, would even see the benefit. And so from the beginning, I was very much interested in what are the things that this person, let's say you, right? What are the things that you do that you're already doing that can contribute to the kinds of outcomes and goals that I have? So let me capture that. Let me approach you around that piece. I'm not going to try to get you to immediately do things that are different from what you might be doing. I'm really going to focus in on what are the things you're already doing. And so that kind of philosophy and approach is still with us and with our team, and is part of the reason why we've been successful at collaborating with lots of different types of people and organizations. What the collaboration looks like can be very different. With some, it might be one of our research faculty and another faculty member like working on a long-term research project together. But it could also mean someone speaking at a conference that we might be hosting. Or we, before COVID and the quarantine, we had lots of events that were in communities that we were working in. And so some of that collaboration might be having someone who's at a university in a different geography, right? That's in a place that we might be working, having them come and participate in an event that we might be hosting in just in their backyard, right? Because it may be a great opportunity for their students. And so there's just really, again, thinking about what are all the different ways that people can be supportive and helpful to us, and trying to match those. So, if there's not like there's this perfect person that's out there, and I was like, this person we have to collaborate with. That's not really our approach. The approach is, here are all the things that we need help with. Let's find people who may be already doing pieces of those and see if we can bring them into working with us again around those things they care about. And potentially later on, like yourself, they want to come work with us. But that's not a requirement necessary, any of that, because we just got a lot of work to do. So that takes a lot. Telling people to change their completely do a complete job right away, it takes a lot of time, and we don't have time to do that.
Mark, you support also informed political dialogue by hosting events that bring together policymakers, practitioners, investors, entrepreneurs, and academics. Can you talk about how different are, according to your knowledge, these points of view, the goals and the mindsets of these different actors?
Broadly speaking, much of what different people from different places, backgrounds, disciplines want as end goals is the same. Much of it is, at least based on what people say or seem to say, right? The end goals, broad brush, are very similar. It's the process to get there that can be extraordinarily different, sometimes completely incompatible with each other, as well as what the risk is to them as an individual or to their profession broadly. And we kind of see this playing out in sort of the political space, right? In terms of, we don't need to go into too much detail on this topic, but let's say like gun control, right? I think most people would like for fewer people to die from guns, or right? I think that's as an end goal. I think most people would want that. But the process to get there, like that's okay. There's no longer people are no longer on the same page, and the page they're on sometimes are completely are diametrically opposed to each other. Similar to this idea about when we're working with academics across different disciplines and bringing people together, all those different groups that you mentioned, there are things that they're doing. There are individuals within those different communities that where there's alignment, right? With not just with the end goal, but with the type of process that we might be interested in. So to give you an example, one of those groups you mentioned was like investors. There are a significant number of investors, sort of private equity, venture capital type folks who are very interested in seeing economic development in distressed places in rural America. Right? Now, in the most of the work they currently are doing, they may not be investing in businesses in those places, but sometimes they're maybe from one of those places and they have this interest. And so one of the ways that I might engage them is well, what can we do to help you identify ways that you can actually begin to invest your wealth in places that actually need it? And can we start to bring to just the surface area, right? Just bring your knowledge, bring you closer to understanding what some of those opportunities might be. And that's the kinds of things that we can do because they're interested in investing. I was like, okay, cool. That's what you want to invest in stuff. Let's see if we can find you some things to invest in places that are underinvested in, that pay really good wages. Maybe a business that's owned by a Native American person or a woman. So are there some of these aspects that we can find that common ground for really any of these different types of groups of people that we might be working with?
Clear and very nice example. Thank you, Mark. I'm going to ask you two questions that I presented at the very beginning. And the first one is, how exciting is to live and to work in this intersection of academics, policy, and business?
It's a mixed bag, really. I mean, like with any job. The work that is the most exciting is working in the communities that we work in. I mean, there are so many phenomenally amazing people all over the place that are doing amazing things. And it's really a privilege for us to, try to bring some of the resources their way that they should have had access to anyway. Right. And so that's wonderful. We hire students from a lot of different, actually from about 20 different universities. And it's also really nice to not only work with the great students here at UNC, but also work with really amazing students at other universities that, may not be as highly ranked, but just these like amazing students with amazing stories that are passionate and just amazing. Right. And so that can be really great. I have grown to be okay with raising money. A lot of my time is spent, raising grant dollars and sponsorships and things like that. So sometimes that's okay, and sometimes it's not really pleasant. But overall, the work is really exciting. Like I said, because of the people that we get to work with, and hopefully have a positive impact on their life.
Well, what is the most difficult thing? Is like the bringing in the funding? Is that the most difficult thing, or there's something else that disturb you more?
Yeah, no, that's not. It's not that it's. I mean, it is challenging. It's just not what I would necessarily choose to spend my Saturday afternoon doing. Right. I think some of the more challenging things come into play. I mentioned that. I gave this kind of gun control example, right? That oftentimes when you take a step deeper, besides like what that end goal is, that there are groups that are just diametrically opposed. So that exists and that's real, and it's pervasive in many of the places that we work in, right? Everyone can kind of agree on the long-term goal, but the ideas on how to get there aren't compatible, and we can play some role, perhaps, in helping other people see what are different pathways to those outcomes. but oftentimes we can see we see those issues right clearly from this third party perspective, and sometimes it can be depressing, right? Because you see that all the elements are there, right? They have all the assets, physical, human resources, even financing currently, all those things there, but it's the relationships and the difficulty of those relationships in that place that prevent it from realizing that potential. And we run into that, and that can be difficult because like you know it, you see it, but you can't necessarily fix it. Right.
Mark, what are you proud of?
That's I'll answer your question. It's um I try not to be proud of anything, just as a rule. Like I also try not to regret anything. But I'll answer your question in terms of what work that we've done that I think we've done well. And I'll go back to something I mentioned. I think there's lots of individual projects that we've worked on that have ended well, have created jobs. But I think the spaces that we've created, like the physical spaces where we bring together different people for these events or various things that we do, those some of those are quite unique and special. And I like that about our work, right? It's almost, and when we're planning these events, like we spend a lot of time like, okay, we need this kind of person and this person in the room. What order should they be speaking in, and who should go first? And it's orchestrated, uh, and it can be really beautiful when it comes together because it has an aesthetic element to it. We're very intentional about the place that we have it in terms of it may have a historical importance. We're very deliberate about the mix of people who are speaking and how different people may be elevated in importance who aren't normally elevated, right, in that particular place because of these elements of history. We always have really good food that has oftentimes some historical connection or story to tell itself. And it really said those events can be really special, and it's something that I'm particularly interested that we try to get back to once people are fully vaccinated and we can have gatherings in person, because those are the things that we don't have to do, right? In terms of all the grant funding or whatever we do, that's not have a great event is not it's not on the checklist of our reporting. But what those things can create, the kind of connections and appreciation for a place and the people in it is, like I said, is special, and the way that we do it is quite unique. And so I like it when we can get
Yeah.
those things together.
Well, they should be written in the report because that is when you create, as you said, connection, but also pride, and
Mhm.
and you allow those feelings to come out
Yeah.
and be more engaged. And sometimes, like a special event is the beginning of something. Maybe you drag in one anonymous student that in the future become a very important person. So let's write them down in the reports. This special
Well, no,
event.
we definitely report them. We report them. But they're just not. One of the things I tell my team is like, look, here are the things that they want. We're going to tell them everything, and they can they can decide what's important to them. So yeah, we
Yeah.
definitely report it.
Mark, what is next?
I got to pick up my kids
Okay,
from
very
daycare.
good.
So that's what's next. So what? No, but to really answer your question, we're uh, hopefully about to start an additional initiative. So I mentioned these different areas that we work in. Excited about something we're about to launch that is of this flavor. So it has some elements of policy and research and work on the ground, but it kind of takes a different perspective. So a lot of the work on the ground that we have been doing is so to speak, supply side. So working with businesses that might be producing some good or service. And this initiative that we're about to launch is working with the buyers. So essentially working with anchor institutions. So hospitals, universities, potentially, state governments or local governments. So these institutions that purchase lots of things, goods, serve, manufactured things, agricultural products, et cetera. And working with them to use that procurement power to drive the kinds of systemic change that we're talking about, right? So creating shared economic prosperity. This past year has, for many people, for a larger number of people, illuminated some of the problems with not just the U.S. economy, with the global economy, and how it benefits and harms different people um, based on lots of different things, whether it's historical, geographic, racial, et cetera. And so what we think now is that there is momentum for some of these anchor institutions to think beyond just their number one goal. So to give you an example, like a university. So a typical university is interested in teaching students, doing some research, and having some kind of maybe community engagement. And I should probably put sports in there too, because some of the universities, that's probably their number one or number two goal. But procurement is lower down on that list. But all of the millions, tens of millions, for some universities, hundreds of millions of dollars that are spent annually, that's actually an opportunity for that institution to have an impact on communities that have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19, to have an impact on minority-owned businesses, to have an impact on businesses that are in rural places that may not be well connected. And so this initiative, as I mentioned, that we're hopefully will be launching soon, is to work with anchor institutions that have that desire, that interest in having this broader economic impact, and helping them transition some portion, right, of their procurement to have this direct impact on people and places, to create more, I said, this goal that we have of creating shared economic prosperity, and additionally creating a network of people and other institutions across the U.S. Who have similar goals and share information, et cetera. So that's what we've been working on for the past, actually really past year, but hopefully we'll launch it officially fairly soon.
I would talk with you more and forever, but we are at the top of the hour. So I would like to leave you a couple of minutes with an open mic, just in case you want to say something else, something that you couldn't say, or something that I didn't ask you. And if you want to address the audience, the mic is open and it's yours.
I can say, if anybody happens to have made it this far in the video, I'm impressed, and feel free to email me or give me a call if you want to catch up about any of this stuff or whatever. I'm pretty easy to find at UNC. My name is Mark Little. So yeah, feel free to contact me, reach out.
Thank you very much, Mark. We were in conversation with Mark Little. Little is the executive director of CREATE, an initiative that builds shared prosperity through applied interventions, research, and policy. And obviously, Mark is part of the great family of geologists and geophysicists. So we welcome him very warmly here in the Mini Geology Show, where we put in connection geology with society at large. This is Daniel Minizini, your inquisitive geologist, with another program of Mini Geology. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.